very, very important subject. We pray that you'll illuminate, Lord, truth for us tonight. And your scripture says that we're to have always ready an answer for every person, every question concerning our faith. And this faith goes not only back, Lord, to Israel, it goes back to the very founding of our nation, which gives integrity to the very stance of a nation being one nation under God based on Judeo-Christian ethics. So we pray that you'll bless our time together tonight, and we give you the glory in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Come on in here. Come on.
The brothers are coming.
All right. Hey, for those of you at home, the series that we're involved in is the 12 Stones of Remembrance. It began with the first 10 weeks being miracles that happened with the founding of our nation. Very important, because I simply raised the question, what would it be like for the Jewish people today if they did not have the Old Testament? What would it be like for Christians if we did not have a written New Testament? Well, in either case, you would have only oral tradition. It would be very difficult in terms of when the enemy would try to divide with just the oral tradition. And so I raised the question, if the same God that we believe in that did miracles in the Old and the New Testament came to our nation at the very founding based on the Judeo-Christian thrust that we were based in our nation on and did miracles, what would happen then to us as a nation if those stories, those facts that happened, those miracles that transpired, what would it be like if those were taken away? Well, that's what has happened. They've been taken away. 1962, 63, then in 1980 with the Ten Commandments, when prayer, Bible study, the Ten Commandments were taken out of the schools, it would be almost suicidal for a teacher today to say, I want to talk to you about American history today, and I want to talk to you about the miracles that God did in its founding. They'd be so quickly taken into HR, and they would not be able to do that. So it's actually been ripped away from us, and as a result of that, we have what we've had today in terms of legislation coming in, people having to go to school meetings screaming and yelling because of the fact of laws and basically laws that are trying to be passed that are not only against the Word of God, but against common sense. And so that's what we're restoring here on these Wednesdays. We have services at 3 and 6:30, and we're trying to restore that. The first 10 weeks, we took a look at miracles that transpired, about 20 of them, that really are uncontested miracles that transpired. Not written because of someone that was going to later on in the 19th or 20th century give their opinion on what happened, but actually quotes from the founding fathers, from the people that participated in its founding, and they wrote what they saw and how they interpreted it. And that's only truly, that's the only real gauge that you can give on the veracity of the American Revolution, is what did they say? What did they see? What were these things that happened that they gave no other explanation than the answer to their prayers that God intervened for them? Now in weeks 11 and 12, we're going to deal, in today's week 11, we're going to deal with two questions that are the most common objections to even entertaining the American Revolution. And the reason or rationale given is the fact that, well, these guys all owned slaves. And if they owned slaves, how in the world, why should we listen to them? What credibility do they have if they have gone against common decency and simply common sense in terms of treating people unfairly in a previous generation? So that's what we're going to entertain tonight. We're going to give the answers to that. And what you'll find is, again, I'll be quoting time and time again from the founders, from the people that actually endured it. Also, I want to make mention of the fact that most of what we're going to deal with today are Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. They're the ones that are typically vilified because they are right at the pinnacle of the fathers that started this nation. And because they were both slave owners, they're immediately attacked, vilified, and then just discounted and pushed to the side by people that don't want to really know the history of our country. So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to get into it right now, other than saying I made the mention of the fact that a lot of the material that I'm giving tonight has been developed over 60 years, because it really goes back to the early 70s when I was ministering in inner city LA, Watts and the Wilshire Fairfax district. And my wife and I were in an all African American church for almost 2 years. And during that time, because of the ministry I was involved in, That was basically 1973 and 1974. I got a call in 1976 from the American Baptist Churches. American Baptist Churches is the denomination I was in at the time. It was also the denomination of Martin Luther King Sr. and Jr. And I've shared before, I had the opportunity of talking with Martin Luther King Sr. because when I was there in the 70s, Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated mid-60s. But during that time, I got a really interesting phone call in 1976, and they asked me to come back, even though I wasn't at that point in time. Well, I was still in the American Baptist churches, but I hadn't been in the ministry inner city for 2 years, and I got a call, and they wanted to present me with something, and that was the Mate Award, 1976. So on it says 1976 Mate Award, Reverend Roger Friend, and you'll see the hands of the different cultures bound together, because it was based, actually in other denominations this would have been considered the Urban League Award. The reason they gave it to me in 1976, though I had been gone for 2 years, is this was the inaugural presentation. This was the first time they awarded it, and because of my work 2 years before, they wanted to honor me with the first one. And so my background in the area of this type of ministry goes way back. I had a youth group of about 30 all-black students, kids in the youth group, and I taught black history. The kids called me Casper, after Casper the ghost, and but I taught black history, and so I had to do studies on that, because I'm really a kid out of Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the South. I only say y'all. That's the only. Well, I'm 76 now, going on 77. So I was in my 20s. Come on in, everybody. We're going here. Okay. So having said that, I have a real interest in this area. And that actually led to, like last night, I was at the funeral. Last night I was at the funeral at the Peacock Theater in Los Angeles for Sonny Arganzoni, the founder of the Victory Outreach. It was very moving. It was a tremendous service. There were 7,000 people there. And you had to go by personal invitation. I had my own car, thing I had to show him at the door because for the invitation of it. So this type of ministry is very important, and getting to the facts is important. Last week I shocked some of you, and if you weren't here last week, the reason I shocked was I asked if anybody knew what saved the term "In God We Trust," because it was in 2018 a group of 27 atheists sued to get "In God We Trust" off of the coins, off of the currency. And they gave some layman's reasons why. And it was part of what saved "In God We Trust" was a 1993 piece of legislation. It dealt with the Religious Fairness Act. And so I asked everybody here, does anybody know who the congressman was that brought that piece up to get it passed? And of course, no one would believe what I shared. The answer was Chuck Schumer. It was Chuck Schumer who presented that in 1993, that we look now on it today and say, thank you, Chuck Schumer. And that also leads us to understand something about politics. We should always be praying and open for good movements, people to move positively in a positive role, for them to have an experience with God. And so here you look at 1993, and now you look at 2025, and it's entirely different from his perspective of what he brings forth as legislation. But again, to me, we have to be continually praying and pushing and open for people to have a Jesus moment, okay, in their lives. To understand slavery in America, you have to have a little bit of a historical understanding. I'll make this very brief, but I think it's imperative to see a context, because a lot of times people in our century here, or in our time, will look back and try to interpret what was going on in the minds of the people back then based on their knowledge of things here today, which is a very, very shaky way to do it. And you're going to get a lot of untruths that are presented because of that. So what we're going to do is, you're going to hear me give quotes today, and they're quotes from the people that were going through it, because some legitimate questions have to be asked to both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington about why, once you once we became the United States of America in 1789, why didn't you free all of your slaves? Okay, and that's a legitimate question, and we'll get to that in a little bit. To understand how the evil known as slavery was ever introduced to our country, a short history of its arrival on American soil is important. Early British slaving voyages date to 1562. Now, in terms of for the U.S., it's going, or America at that time, it'll be a little later. John Hawkins is considered the first English slave trader. He left England in 1562 on the first of 3 slaving voyages. At that time, British interests lay with the west coast of Africa. Plantation slavery was introduced in the Americas between 1619 and 1640. Britain and Portugal were the 2 most prominent slave trading countries, accounting for about 70% of all Africans transported to the Americas. By 1640, slavery of black Americans was established on American soil. Extremely important, because you're going to have to go 1640 to 1776. That's many generations where slavery was in America because we were a British colony. Because we're a British colony, we're totally dependent on the crown, on King George, and the one that will become very important is King George III, in terms of what they said in England towards us, what we could and what we couldn't do. Britain was the most dominant in terms of transportation of slaves between 1640 and 1807. It is estimated, check this figure out, it is estimated that Britain transported 3.1 million Africans to the British colonies in the Caribbean, North and South America, and other countries. From the beginning, opposition voices emerged condemning slavery in America. One of the first of those voicing opposition were the Quakers of Pennsylvania, and that took place in 1688. So you can see 1640, it's established here in the country. I'm sure voices were going on, but the notable ones happened when the Quakers came forth as a group from Pennsylvania, and they adopted the first formal anti-slavery resolution in American history. Then, as sentiment against Britain grew during the 1700s, the slave trade issue took center stage in 1773. When an anonymous piece was presented to the Massachusetts legislature revealing public sentiment during the period leading up to our Declaration of Independence. And I'm not going to, it's very lengthy, I'm not going to read it to you, but it was the first that was recorded. Thomas Jefferson of my state, Virginia, inherited slaves but desired an end to King George's demands for its continuation. So here we start. We're going to do it in reverse order. We're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson and then go back to George Washington, because I think it's really important to understand Thomas Jefferson. And then as you add George Washington to it, you can see the sentiment, you can see the understanding as they were dealing with the problem of slavery in America. Thomas Jefferson of Virginia inherited slaves, but desired an end to King George's demands for its continuation. In Jefferson's original penning of the Declaration of Independence, his hatred for the institution of slavery is obvious. He referred to King George III, and these are the words that he wrote. Now, this is the first one. This is not the final draft. And the reason being, and I'll give proof of this in just a minute from somebody's letter to Jefferson, but Jefferson hated slavery. He makes it very clear here, but it was never going to fly with the rest of the southern states, Georgia, South Carolina, the Deep South. It was never going to fly because of the fact that, remember, American Revolution, 13 colonies become 13 states, but they're going to now have to meet at the Constitutional Convention, and the number one thing that they're looking for is the fragile condition of the union of these states. How can it remain without blowing apart and everyone going their separate way? So there's going to have to be compromises going there. Now, as I'm sharing some of these facts along the way, you're going to see it's the exact same things you're seeing in the news today. You're dealing with the exact same issues. How much authority does the president of the country have? How much authority does the Congress have? Where do the courts? How about a district court judge? How much authority does he have? And that the reason that this is important is the founders of this nation created this type of checks and balances within the nation so they could fight it. So if one person goes to an extreme and people go, that's never happened before, then they're going to fight it in court all the way up to the Supreme Court. So this is real time things that we're speaking of today, okay, in terms of the inner workings of the government. This is what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the first draft, still in existence today. For those who have taken or have been with us for a while, I use the term extant, E-X-T-A-N-T, which means it's still existing today, okay? You can go see it in a museum. Here's what he wrote, quote, "He," referring to King George III, "has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, opprobrium, disgraceful is what that means. Just a big word, okay? Is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislated attempt to prohibit or to restrain." Okay, so what's he saying there? He said, look, we've been sending up things, complaints to you over and over again. You won't give us even a hearing. You know, we have no place before the crown. That's what he's referring to here. Remember, this is 1776 now. This is the Declaration of Independence. We are about to declare our independence and go to war with Great Britain. Okay, so this is what he's writing. He, speaking of King George III, has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce, which simply means abominable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms amongst us. What's happened here? So we're complaining, we're getting near war, and behind the scenes, the British are now offering freedom, offering finances for the slaves to rise up against the American slave owners, even though it was Britain who's controlling it and maintaining it here in the Americas. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people for whom he also obtruded them. It means he's the one that won't let us set people free. Thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Is everybody with me here? This is Thomas Jefferson's writings, okay? In response to this first rendering for our Declaration of Independence, John Adams later commented. Remember, we go in terms of presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. They're friends. At this time, they're friends. They're going to lose some of that friendship along the way. But this is what John Adams writes back to Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "I was delighted with the draft's high tone and the flights of oratory with which it abounded, especially that concerning Negro slavery, which, though I knew that his Southern brethren would never suffer to pass in Congress, I certainly would never oppose. Congress cut off about a quarter of it, as I expected they would, but they obliterated some of the best of it and left all that was exceptionable, if anything in it was." So that's the response of John Adams to Thomas Jefferson's first draft. Okay. Then in 1778, with Jefferson's leadership, slave importation was banned in Virginia, one of the first jurisdictions worldwide to do so. Jefferson was a lifelong advocate of ending the trade, and as president led the effort to criminalize the international slave trade that passed Congress, and he signed in 1807, shortly before Britain passed a similar law. In 1779, as a practical solution to end the legal enslavement of humans, Jefferson supported gradual emancipation, training, and colonization of of African American slaves rather than unconditional emancipation, believing that releasing unprepared people with no place to go and no means to support themselves would only bring them misfortune. So in terms of the arguments that were going on, this was it. Amongst those that believed that slavery was an abomination, okay, we've had this in 1640. What do we do now? Okay, so the answers ranged from simply total emancipation, let them go, versus, hey, what's going to happen if we do let them go? And so then the good slave owners, if I could put it that way, no, there was no good slave owner, but those that were kind to the people that were imprisoned on their property, they felt that, you know what, at least I'm taking care of them. What's going to happen if there's a total immediate emancipation? Do you understand what I'm saying? They were arguing these sorts of questions. Then in 1784, Jefferson proposed federal legislation banning slavery in the new territories of the North and South after 1800, which failed to pass Congress by one vote in 1800. Now, along the way, you had not only Jefferson, you had others warning that if this was not legislatively handled, if slavery was not taken out, it was going to end up in civil war, which it will. On July 14, 1787, Jefferson wrote to Edward Rutledge, who was the youngest signatory of the Declaration of Independence and who later served as the 39th governor of South Carolina. Quote, I congratulate you, my dear friend, on the law of your state suspending the importation of slaves, and for the glory you have justly acquired by endeavoring to prevent it forever. This abomination must have an end, and there is a superior bench reserved in heaven for those who hasten it. So there's Thomas Jefferson saying, okay, we're going to do our best to end this here, but those that, there's another judge that's working here too. On February 11, 1788, Jefferson wrote to Brison de Warville, French journalist, abolitionist, and revolutionary, quote, you know that nobody wishes more ardently to see an abolition not only of the trade, but of the condition of slavery. And certainly nobody will be more willing to encounter every sacrifice for that object. And he's speaking legislatively. I'm going to keep working for this for it to end. But, here's the question. But why didn't Jefferson just release his slaves once we won our independence from Great Britain? The answer, the Constitutional Convention dealt with the issue of slavery. There was opposition to ending it, southern states, especially from Georgia and South Carolina, though others also voiced opposition to ending it. Eventually, those who despised the ungodly institution relented. They believed the importance of keeping the fragile nation together took precedence, and placing the 3/5 clause in the body of the Constitution would hasten slavery's demise. The point I want to make here is that the common argument about the Constitution and Thomas Jefferson is that the 3/5 clause said that the African American was only worth 3/5 of a white person. Okay, that was the argument. It was faulty, and I'll show why, but it still goes on today. I've watched newscasters say that, okay? But I'll give you the truth of it in just a minute. Okay, additionally, Jefferson lived in Virginia where there were laws in that state, because it was a slave-owning state, Virginia, which prohibited Virginians from doing so. Manumission, which is the voluntary act of master freeing a slave, okay, manumission. I was unfamiliar with it until I learned that a ways back. Manumission, manumission. It's the accents on the mi, mission, which is the voluntary act of a master freeing a slave, was not always easy or possible in Virginia. At times it was illegal, and even when allowed, it required court permission, which could be difficult to obtain. Adding to Jefferson's difficulty was the problem that Jefferson was in debt throughout his life, and one of Virginia's laws exposed the slaves to his debtors upon their release. Now, one thing I've done since we started this, I tried to present everything fairly and rightly. And I've shared when we looked at some of the miracles that George Washington at times was not a really great predictor of what was about to happen, and he made some drastic mistakes. Thomas Jefferson, we're going to see, made some mistakes too. These people were not perfect. The only one that's perfect is God. But if you're really attempting to make things right based on a Judeo-Christian viewpoint, a biblical viewpoint, God's going to be there with you. He's going to support you in that. And so that's what I'm really trying to, get across here. Throughout his life, Jefferson believed that their release would not go well for them with potential poverty or subsequent bad treatment by the hands of new ownership of those who disliked him. Despite these legal and personal constraints, Jefferson did free some enslaved people, including 2 during his lifetime, 5 in his will, and allowed 2 or 3 to escape without pursuit. Here's an important question. What was the source of Jefferson's indebtedness that put him in that situation, that if he released the slaves, they might fall into hands of those that disliked him, or they fall into hands of people that wouldn't care for them? Here's the reasons. Inherited debt. Jefferson inherited significant debts from his father-in-law, John Wales, in the 1770s, along with land and enslaved people. There was no bankruptcy in the 1770s. If you had a father, mother that had indebtedness, they died, it's passed on to the child. Okay? There's no way to avoid that. In this case, when he married his wife's father had the debt, but as soon as they got married and he died, that indebtedness came upon him. Okay? Also, lavish lifestyle. Jefferson was known for extravagant spending on building projects, furnishings, wine, and other luxuries, including his estate, Monticello. Can you show us Monticello? Now, I've been there several times, and I'm going to get to a point here in a minute where that's going to be sold because of Jefferson's indebtedness after he died, and that sold back then for $7,500. You could own Monticello, and I've been there. It's an extraordinary place, okay? Another reason that he got into debt was plantation agriculture challenges. While Jefferson was wealthy in land and enslaved people, farming proved to be an unreliable and inadequate source of income, especially during periods of economic downturn like the Panic of 1819. Does anybody here know what caused the Panic of 1819? What did we talk about last week? The War of? Right. And who won that? Yeah, correct. We did. All right, we did. And so the British took off. Now, that was to our benefit. God did something there, too. And that was that the Napoleonic Wars, which Britain was involved with England, Britain was involved with France. And remember, Britain and France for hundreds of years are fighting for supremacy of the world. And Napoleon, the British, coming into 1812, had basically not totally defeated, but basically defeated, and sent Napoleon to an island to stay there. Right? Okay. So, but what happened was, in 1812, during the war, all of a sudden Napoleon escaped from Elba and was coming back to France to reinitiate the war, right? So England had all the British troops withdraw. It was just following what David said, following the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, that right after our victory there, and we'd already kicked them out of New York and Baltimore, or at least lessened their control there, they pulled everybody back from the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, but they decided, here we go, they're going to attack in a different way. So leading up to 1819, the British started flooding Europe with cheap goods, so that our goods they didn't want in Europe anymore. And they started flooding America with cheap goods so that our goods would not sell, trying to bankrupt us. What happened was the crash or the Panic of 1819. And everything went bad. And again, what was causing, the reason I say that is this is the whole arguments of tariffs today by President Trump. Tariffs historically have been done at a time when you are low on money, okay? The first tariff ever done was by George Washington. It's called the Tariff of 1789 when we became a nation, because we were so bankrupt because of the American Revolution that he had to put tariffs on other countries so that they could get money into their accounts. Okay, you've heard President Trump, one of his idols is President McKinley. McKinley had the most tariffs in the history of any president in the United States of America. So you can see why he likes him. Okay, and so today we're $37 trillion in debt, and so Trump is insisting on tariffs to bring back to an even playing field the economies of the world, including us, so that we're not being taken advantage of, but that we're being evenly treated. Is everybody with me there? Understand that? So these things are repeating themselves over and over again. Okay? There's nothing new under the sun. When you come to economic affairs, dealings between nations, dealing with the peoples, you're going to see things repeat themselves over and over again. Unreliable payments. Jefferson, while a major creditor himself, faced challenges in collecting payments owed to him, further restraining his finances. Co-signed debt. Does the Bible say anything about co-signing? Jefferson co-signed a loan for a friend, and when the friend passed away, Jefferson was forced to take on the unpaid debt. I already mentioned the financial panic of 1819. Debt passed to heirs because of the laws of the day. I mentioned this also. Jefferson could not declare bankruptcy, and his debts were passed on to his heirs. Monticello. The construction and upkeep of Monticello, his beloved estate, also contributed to his indebtedness. Can you imagine? Just take that and apply it to today, okay? Where you're going through a soft economy, all right? And now you're finding your property taxes going up, your insurance is going up, and people are finding this, they weren't prepared for that. They thought that fixed loan, even if they took a fixed loan, was going to be the same forever. But what they didn't take into account was home insurance and property tax. Anybody can relate to this? I mean, you understand? Okay, it's real life, okay? And this is what he went through. So at his death, or debt at death, Jefferson died with debts exceeding $107,000, a sum equivalent to over $1 million today. So here, Jefferson, who is one of the great heroes of the of the constitutional government and a brilliant mind, he still found himself not handling finances well because of external events going on around and about him. So again, this is a look at a true hero of our country, but then he basically died in debt, okay? And so he created a lottery. In an attempt to raise funds, Jefferson devised a public lottery to raise money and clear his debts, but it was not enough. After Jefferson's death, I almost said his executors. His executors. They kind of did execute him, okay? They executed his monies, okay? They were forced to sell his land, house, $7,500, household contents, and enslave people to cover his debts. Okay, so that's a look at Thomas Jefferson. Let me just say this as a summary. His writings show he hated slavery. Also, he lived in a time where, as they came up with the Constitutional Convention, they wanted to keep the Union together at all costs, so they compromised, even against what they believed in. Thirdly, because of the fact of the laws at the time, they were somewhat constrained. And then, from a personal viewpoint, what was going to happen to those that he had been taking care of during all that time, to unscrupulous people or people that did not like him. Here's George Washington. George Washington likewise condemned the practice of slavery. He stated, now I'm going to read this one. This is very important because here he's going to state where the founding fathers were coming from. Remember, they left England because of the tyrannical things that the king did over there. Okay, they had what they call the Star Chamber courts, which were they had their parliamentary courts, but they also had the Star Chamber courts, which were run by the king. The king could take anybody they wanted to, put them under trial, convict them, and then send them to the Tower of London for either death or for torture. Okay, they couldn't preach on the streets. There was all these things that caused our forefathers to leave Britain and come to America. So when they came up with the Constitution, they put in there explicitly things that they weren't going to allow to happen here that were happening there. And they felt the total, I can't say total, but the huge mountain that caused the problems over there was the divine right of kings. That the king could do no wrong. That the king would just, he was God, okay, basically. And that's what created the star chambers and a lot of the atrocities. They weren't going to allow that to happen. So they said that the law system was not the problem. The law system was not the problem from England. It was the king's interference. So they basically took the law system from England and applied it here without the concept of the divine right of kings. Okay, is everybody with me here on this? And so you're going to hear what George Washington says concerning the importance of things, even though we don't like them, happening legislatively to cause the people to rally together for things that they knew were morally right when somebody unscrupulous got into a position of power so they could get them out. Is that going on today? That's going on today. Okay, so this is just repeating itself over and over again. Yes. All right, George Washington. Here's what, quote George Washington, quote, "I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. But there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority. And this, as far as my vote and support will go, shall never be lacking." So he hated slavery, wanted it ended, but like the founders, they believed in due process, they believed in the legislative action, and they actually, by the inclusion of the 3/5 clause, actually that was to hasten the demise or death of it, and we'll see that again in a minute. Washington maintained this position throughout his life. When General Marquis de Lafayette, we've seen Lafayette show up a lot of times here, when General Marquis de Lafayette purchased a plantation in French Guiana for the purpose of freeing its slaves and placing them on the estate as tenants, Washington wrote to Lafayette, quote, "Your late purchase of an estate in the colony of Cayenne with a view of emancipating the slaves on it is a generous and noble proof of your humanity. Would to God a like spirit would diffuse itself generally into the minds of the people of this country, but I despair of seeing it. Some petitions were presented to the Virginia Assembly." Remember, Washington and Jefferson both live in Virginia. Some petitions were presented to the Virginia Assembly at its last session for the abolition of slavery, but they could scarcely obtain a reading. Is that familiar? A person in charge of the House or the Senate won't even bring it to the floor? Okay, so we're dealing with some of the same issues today. To his nephew and private secretary, Lawrence Lewis, Washington wrote, quote, "I wish from my soul that the legislature of this state could see the policy of a gradual abolition of slavery." So he agreed like Thomas Jefferson. This has to be done slowly. They're going to come up with a mechanism of it. But they can't get to first base. They want to get home, and they're still not getting to first base with the legislature. Why? Because it's the South. And we'll see exactly why in just a couple of minutes. Some people mistakenly think the Constitution, which was passed in 1787, was a pro-slavery document. You hear it today on the news. I hear it all the time. And they'll immediately go to the 3/5 and say they're all racist. Why would we listen to that? Let's do away with the Constitution. It's only served us 250 years, right? Okay. Frederick Douglass. Let's have Frederick Douglass's picture. Oh, I like that one of Monticello. Okay, there's Frederick Douglass. He was a slave, and then he gained his freedom. Frederick Douglass argued that the Constitution was actually an anti-slavery document by correctly interpreting the 3/5 clause. This clause had nothing to do with the worth of the individual black slave. It was a compromise introduced by Northern anti-slavery proponents so that slave states who believed their slaves were nothing but property could no longer count their slaves as free persons when it came to elections. So here's what was happening. It's interesting because the South, they were playing both sides of the coin. for one thing, they called their slaves property to avoid a certain tax that they would have to pay. Then on the other hand, when it came to having representatives from your country, think about it for a second. What's happened to the state of California because of the migration out? What's going to happen real quickly? It's already happened. In terms of your representatives from the state of California, do you have more or less now? Less, because you have a smaller population. And because we're now a smaller population, we're going to get less 2 to 5. I can't remember what they finally came up with, representatives. Well, in the South, they called on the one hand, the plantation owners called on the one hand the slaves as property. But then when it came to the voting, they presented them as a block. So if I had 150 slaves, they called for a vote. As the slave owner, I was able to not only put my vote in, my wife's vote in, the kids' vote in if they were of age, but I would take that block of 150 slaves and give 150 more votes. So what that would do is that would increase the number of representatives, but because it was a slave-owning state, it was going to be somebody against or for slavery. Does that make sense to everybody? That's what the 3/5 clause is all about. Douglas wrote, quote, "It is a downright disability laid upon the slaveholding states." He's talking here about the 3/5 clause. "It is a downright disability laid upon the slaveholding states, one which deprives those states of 2/5 of their natural basis of representation. A black man in a free state is worth just 2/5 more than a black man in a slave state as a basis of political power under the Constitution." What's he saying there? He's saying they wrote into the Constitution that if you were in a free state, an anti-slavery state, then the person that's a freed slave is worth 2/5 more in terms of for the vote. And now he was using this in a negative, and I'll see that right here. "Therefore, instead of encouraging slavery, the Constitution encourages freedom by giving the increase of 2/5 of political power to free over slave states. So much for the 3/5 clause. Taking it at its worst, it still leans to freedom, not slavery. For be it remembered that the Constitution nowhere forbids a colored man to vote." Now this is key, because what he said there, the Constitution nowhere forbids a colored man, a person of color. And again, I'm using the terms whether I'm reading and it's Negro, whether it's a colored man. I'm using it within the context. We don't use those terms today. Is everybody understanding what I'm saying here? Okay. "As a result of this constitutional provision, slave states could only use the 3/5 standard, which limited their number of representatives by allowing only 3 out of every 5 of their total number of slaves to be counted as voters. Additional congressional acts concerning slavery." Now, the reason I said that was a key thing, we're going to be moving now towards legislation that would promote the ending of slavery. But then we're going to see a counter to it also. In 1789, the Northwest Ordinance forbade slavery in any territory seeking statehood. In 1808, Congress abolished the slave trade. But from 1820 to 1860, both the Supreme Court and Congress had a Southern Democrat majority. Now think about that. For 40 years, from 1820 to 1860, both the Supreme Court and the Congress had a Southern Democrat majority, which means it was the slave owners. Okay. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise, slavery states were allowed into the Union again. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law allowed the capture and return of freed slaves to the southern states. 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act once again allowed slavery in new territories. 1854, the Republican Party was formed with its main concern, the abolishing of slavery. So now we're going to see the abolishing of slavery. Okay, so what I'm saying here is, in 1864, there was no Republican Party. It was the Whigs. The Whigs and that had developed into something else by then. But it was the Democratic Party and then what would become now the Republican Party. The important point is the Republican Party, which will be the party of Abraham Lincoln, was created to fight against the Southern Democratic Party. Okay, the Republican Party handed out their first platform which listed 9 planks, 9 things they stood for. 6 of the 9 planks dealt with civil rights, black equality, and abolishing of slavery. In 1857, we're still under the Democrat-controlled. What's that? We're getting music. Yeah, turn it off, whatever it is, please. Okay, in 1857, the Dred Scott decision passed, which declared blacks were not persons but property. This goes all the way back to what the slave owners did and why they put the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, okay? Let me read it again. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision passed, which declared blacks were not persons but property. This 1857 Supreme Court ruled blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit, end of quote. In 1860, the Republican Abraham Lincoln's platform, up here we're at 1860, remember now it was 1820 to 1860, that the slave owners were in charge of the Supreme Court and the Congress, okay? But in 1860, Abraham Lincoln's platform opposed the fugitive slave law and the Dred Scott decision. The platform's stated goal was to end slavery and win civil rights for all blacks. 1860, as a result of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party presidential victory, 11 southern states seceded from the Union, establishing the slave-holding Confederate States of America. Now think about this. When they came up with the Constitution, their fear was that there would be a breaking apart if they held, I'm speaking of the northern states, if they held their ground and demanded that we wouldn't become a nation unless slavery was dealt away with. And so they gave in to the southern states, okay? But here we are now in 1860, and it ended, and the same thing happened anyway, okay? 1860, as a result of Abraham Lincoln and Republican Party presidential victory, 11 southern states seceded from the Union, establishing the, quote, slave-holding Confederate States of America. In 1862, slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C. 1863, January 1st, Abraham Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, at this point, I think it would be good. Yes, you certainly can.
With the 3/5
clause.
So does that mean for every 5 slaves somebody owned, it could count for 3 votes?
Correct.
But did the slaves actually get to vote?
No.
Or did the owners-
No. The owners did.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So there's a double abomination going on there.
Yes.
Okay. And as a matter of fact, the 3/5 clauses, Article 1, right in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. It's right at the beginning of the Constitution. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Okay. Then on April 9th, 1865, the Civil War ended. And April 14th, 5 days later, President Lincoln was assassinated. Within a year, black Americans were registering to vote. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution to end all forms of racial inequality in the United States. The 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished. That's 1865. 100% of Republicans voted in favor of this constitutional amendment. 23% of Democrats voted in favor of this constitutional amendment. Why? Because the Democrats were made up of the Southern slave owners, okay, where the Republican Party came into being to end slavery. Is everybody with me there? Okay, that's the figures. 14th Amendment, black Americans allowed to run for Congress and are citizens of their state of habitation. That took place in 1868. 94% of Republicans voted in favor of this constitutional amendment. 0% of Democrats voted in favor of this constitutional amendment. Then the 15th Amendment, which guarantees the right of black Americans to vote, came about in 1870. 100% of Republicans voted in favor of the constitutional amendment. 0% of Democrats voted in favor of this constitutional amendment. As a result of these changes, though positively, the first 7 black Americans elected to Congress were Republicans. Hiram Rhodes Revels of Mississippi became the first American black senator, and he was also a pastor. Benjamin Turner from Alabama was a slave during the Civil War and was elected. Robert DeLarge of South Carolina was also born a slave, but was elected. Josiah Wells of Florida, slave during the Civil War, elected to Congress. Jefferson Long of Georgia, born a slave, he became the first black American to present a congressional speech in the U.S. House of Representatives. Joseph Haney Rainey from South Carolina became the first black American to be voted into the House of Representatives, and he also then became the Speaker of the House. Born a slave, he served as a congressman for longer than any other black American of his era. Robert Brown Elliott of South Carolina stated he was only interested in a political party that aligned with the Declaration of Independence and the injunctions of Christianity. Following the Civil War, There they are. Following the Civil War from 1865 to 1876, the Republican-controlled Congress passed 23 civil rights laws. Now, I want to do a little insert here because we have to see now the Democrats in opposition, the Southern Democrats in opposition to slaves being set free, came up with a counter, and that was the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was established in 1866 by Southern Democrats to intimidate and kill Republicans. The Klan killed both black and white Americans. If you were a black American during this time, you were most likely Republican. Of the 4,800 American citizens murdered by the Klan, 3,500 were black and 1,300 were white. Republicans, black and white, who were working for the rights of black Americans were targeted. Push cards were used by the Klan to pursue and kill Republicans. These cards had photos and names listed for each state, okay? Had photos and names listed of white and black Republican members of state legislatures who were called radical members because they supported black American causes, and that's how the Ku Klux Klan would find people that were against slavery to murder, okay? And that's just history, folks. That's just history. In 1871, in a congressional debate over whether Klan members could be held accountable for their crimes, an insightful and prophetic address was given by the person we just noted, Joseph Haney Rainey. Okay? Can you look that up and give us a picture of him, David? Or is it too late? Yeah. Congressman Joseph Haney, Hayne Rainey. Rainey. Okay. Okay, yeah, right there. Okay. One of the first African Americans elected to Congress. This is what he wrote when they brought up before the Congress, should Ku Klux Klan members be persecuted for the evil doings. I'm going to give you a straight quote from his speech. Quote, "When we call to mind the fact that this Klan persecution is waged against men for the simple reason that they dare vote with the Republican Party, the question is sometimes asked, why do not the courts of law afford redress? We answer, because the courts are in many instances under the control of Democrats who are wholly opposed to the impartial administration of law and equity. What benefit would result from appeal to courts whose officers are secretly in sympathy with the very evil against which we are striving? If Negroes, numbering 1/8 of the population of these United States, would only cast their votes in the interest of the Democrats, all open measures of violence against them would immediately be suspended." Let's see. Should we go buy a Tesla or should we go burn a Tesla? You see, human nature doesn't change. The same things they were dealing with in the 1700s are happening today. Let me repeat that again. If I can find the start of it. Oh, if Negroes numbering 1/8 of the population of these United States would only cast their votes in the interest of the Democrats, all open measures of violence against them would immediately be suspended and their rights as American citizens recognized. But I can only say that we love freedom more, vastly more than slavery. Consequently, we hope to keep clear of the Democrats. I will also say that in the state of South Carolina, which I represent, there is no disturbance of an alarming character in any one of the counties in which the Republicans have a majority. The troubles are usually in those sections in which the Democrats have control. I say to the entire membership of the Democratic Party that upon your hands rests the blood of the loyal men of the South. Disclaim it as you will, but the stain is there to prove your criminality before man and God. In the world there is a day of retribution which will surely come. That's speaking prophetically of the Civil War. I pity the man or party of men who would seek to ride into power over the dead body of a legitimate opponent. Ku Klux Klan killings. I can say for my people that we are fully determined to stand by the Republican Party and the government. We have resolved to be loyal and firm. And as Queen Esther said long ago, if we perish, we perish. I earnestly hope this bill will pass. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? Finally, in 1892, the Democrats regained control of both houses and the presidency and repealed all 23 of the civil rights laws. There would not be another civil rights law passed until 1964. In 1964-65, 83% of Republicans voted for these two civil rights constitutional amendments, while only 62% of Democrats voted for the amendments. Okay, so the question that really arises, then I'll open up for you, where did the flip happen? Because historically, the Democrats were made of Southern California, Southern states slave owners, and it carried on through all those legislations that I just talked about to the 1800s and finally until 1964. Where did all of a sudden it become knowledge in our generation that the Democratic Party was a side for right in terms of social issues and the Republicans were wrong? Now remember, during the 70s and early 80s, I saw myself as a social democrat and a fiscal Republican, and I sided. I mean, going back in time, if I had been alive when, say, let's see, who would that be? I would have voted for, who beat Dewey? Truman. I would have voted for Harry Truman. I would have voted for JFK. I was too young at that time. And I certainly wouldn't have voted for some of the Republicans in the 90s and so forth. I would have, okay? So, or 2000s, I should say. And so I look at this, I try to look at this as fairly as possible. And the real shift, does anybody know where the shift took place? It's very apparent. Dwight D. Eisenhower is the one who presented the first civil rights acts in the 50s leading into the 60s. But it was defeated because of what we've seen here. It was a democratically controlled legislature at that time. They wouldn't pass it. But when JFK then got assassinated and Lyndon Baines Johnson took over, he brought it up and took the credit for it. Okay, that's where the shift happened. So we're talking about, what year is Lyndon Baines Johnson? 67, what? 67, 68, during that tumultuous time in our nation from 60 to 70. But again, I've always got to say this. Once you know the history of it, and it's just right there in history, and unfortunately it appears to me that that same spirit that was originally in the Democratic Party is taken over again with the types of legislation that's coming, which then makes me back away from who I was originally back in the 70s fighting, okay? Fighting for rights. We always, as Christians, have to be able to see it from a different perspective. beyond parties, because parties can become evil in any generation. Either party can. Hey, not everybody on either of those parties would I take to dinner, okay? Some of them I would if they paid. I'm sorry, I just had to throw that in. But the point is, as Christians, we have to know our history, understand it, point out truth, and at the same time pray. Pray for our nation. Pray for our leaders. Pray that people will have an awakening of what's right and what is wrong. I mean, we're seeing it happen right now, aren't we, in terms of the people standing up and voting, or people in position of power politically standing up against guys who grew up guys who now want to be girls competing in sports. And the state of Maine's in big, big trouble right now because of their governor. They're trying to impeach her because she's taken the stand that she will fight to her death. She will put her flag on that hill and fight to her death that a man who now wants to be a girl or a woman should be entitled to compete against girls. Okay, so that's what we have to pray for, that there's an awakening in terms of what's morally right and wrong, and a return to the godly things, or as like that fellow said, the combination of the Constitution and Christianity, that vantage point. Again, quoting, when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. Right? But if the wrong person leads, it's a disgrace to any people. Questions? Yes?
You think that you talk about from the repealing from the repealing of the civil rights laws.
Yes.
It's almost 100 years, right?
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm. The repealing of the original is over 100 years. 150 years. See, the 64 law, you're talking about the 64 civil laws, those are still in place.
When did the Democrats repeal?
George, come here, I need your help. You can't? Okay. All right. Go ahead, finish the question, but then I have to give out something here.
So the Democrats repealed, what years do they repeal them? The Democrats, they repealed
Say when you're ready.
the civil rights law.
Let me give it to you the exact date. Hold on here. I'll give you the date.
Yeah, and what was the period in between when those civil rights were repealed and when new ones came up? I know it was 64 or 60.
It went all the way to 64.
So how many years was that?
That's what we're going to determine right now. Yeah, I think it was. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, so I go to the last page, which is page 18. Hold on, folks. There's 17. Okay, no, that's 16. Maybe it's back in here. Nope. Okay, I want to explain that stamp for you, and then we're going to go over these. And Doug, can you pass this out to everybody? This is the one-page summary, and we'll go over it real quickly here. We always do a one-page summary now. Come on now. All right. I got to find page 18. Just bear with me here for a minute because they're out of order. Here we go. Nope. It's page 19.
Pastor, why do you think that the northeastern states are also democratic?
Well, that's just changed over time for different reasons.
But you would think New England and,
Can I get one more?
Hold on here a second. I got to find that page. Now it's got me thinking. Can't find it. Come on. Here. No, this is the push card, so it's one more. Oh, wait, this, okay. Excuse me, that's my fault. I had that insert in there. I'll get it now. I'm looking for 17. 16 and 17. 1860. Nope. Gotta go to 18 then. Bear with me here. Your patience is much appreciated. You know what? I'm going to say, let me give you the date at the end of this because I want to go explain the stamp, and then I can get this for you at the end because I'm not finding the right page. Okay, on the stamp, that's the 100th. Thank you. This is the 100th anniversary of the, as you'll see at the top, 1863 to 1963. So this is 73, 83, 93, 03, 13, 23. So this is 62 years old, this stamp. And it says Emancipation Proclamation, which Abraham Lincoln gave. And then you'll notice in the blue and black, those are chains that have been broken. And that was the 100th anniversary. Okay, but that's what that's all about. For those that haven't been with us, we give out something like this every week. As a matter of fact, last time, that's why I asked if anybody had not received the one about Yorktown. How many of you have not seen the... Okay. Okay. Here's the War of... Who does not have the War of 1812 stamp? Okay, and this one was put out in 1963 also. Let me pass two more down, or three down there. 1, 2. Who else needs a... last week. Who doesn't have a War of... Terry? War of 1812. You were here now? Okay. Okay. Very good. And then who would like a really old stamp? This is the victory at Yorktown. It's a 2-cent stamp, and this came out in 1931. Well, I don't know. You didn't get this? You weren't here for Yorktown? I want to make sure everybody... Okay, hold on. Would you like one too?
Yes.
Who else did not get one?
Oh, that's cool.
Okay, isn't that cool?
Yeah.
Now those three individuals... Yeah.
No, I think I got that one.
Okay, so these three individuals, if you've got really good eyes or you have a magnifying glass, are Rochambeau, the President Washington in the middle, and de Grasse. So those are the three important, two Frenchmen that were extremely important. Rochambeau fought with George Washington. De Grasse, he was the sailor, what would you call it? He was the head sailor. What would that be called? The head mariner. Huh? Yeah, like the admiral. He controlled the whole French Navy, which played a pivotal role. And so that's why in 1931 this was created, because it was 1781, so it was the 250th anniversary. Yeah. So the American... okay, grab this paper. I don't want to keep you too long. For those that haven't been with us or those watching, each week, to help us remember these things, we start at the alphabet with A, B, C, D, and here we are in week 11. Would you know that it's the letter K for this week? Now it's a God incident, okay? So the letter K, King George III, slavery, and the KKK. By 1640, slavery of black Americans was established on American soil. Britain was the most dominant transporter of slaves from 1640 to 1807. Opposition voices emerged as early as 1688, the Quakers, but we were an English colony, and protestations proved to no avail. Thomas Jefferson wrote a scathing and mocking rebuttal to King George III in Jefferson's original penning of the Declaration of Independence, which then the southern states rejected the majority of it. Both Jefferson and George Washington wrote concerning their personal hatred for slavery, but existing laws made it illegal in some time periods and extremely difficult in others to actually emancipate slaves, manumissions. As Frederick Douglass, a freed slave, pointed out, and he was the greatest orator and abolitionist of the 19th century. As Frederick Douglass, a freed slave, pointed out, the 3/5 clause in the Constitution does not favor, but is against slavery. 5 of the slave owners' slaves, which they counted to be property, would only count for 3 in population census, which would then determine how many representatives they would have. The Republican Party was created to end slavery. The Democrats countered with the Ku Klux Klan. With President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, your stamp, the evil of slavery was finally exorcised from our nation. It took an exorcism to get it out. Now, questions or comments?
In the last, the third, where it said the Democrats, was it counted or countered?
Countered. Came against. Questions or thoughts?
Well, I like to, I'm thinking like the way I'm seeing things today,
Okay.
if you look at who has influence in putting VP Vance into power, then I think we have a serious problem with where the direction of things are going.
Who put in who power?
President Vance,
Vice President Vance?
whose influence.
Okay. And okay. So we have a racial problem because of it?
So, come again?
What is the problem?
So I'm saying that the history, the number one, what the Republican Republican Party stands for, and
You mean today?
yeah, today,
Okay.
and even then from the beginning,
Well, no, the Republicans from the beginning were against slavery. Democrats were for slavery.
were for slavery. Were for against. They were against slavery, right? So,
Republicans were against.
yes. So now, there's a man called Peter Thiel.
Okay.
He's the one that had significant influence for Vance to become VP.
Okay.
Yes. And if you maybe go read the history of that man, then you see that what's happening in Washington, in my own view,
Yeah.
is that the big business people, these they're not, I'm not
The
saying
technocrats,
the
yes.
technocrats, not necessarily what you call it, the technological
Yes.
gurus,
I'm with you.
right, have got power and they want government to go in a certain way. And they're taking influence at the top in Washington right now.
Okay.
And starting with really that man called Peter Thiel, because he's the one that introduced it.
Okay. So let me respond to that now. You just gave the argument against the Democratic Party for the last 4 years, that the big owners and the people from up in the techno area in Northern California were pulling the strings, as well as outsiders, so like George Soros. So you can say the exact same argument. The reality, can I give you the reality of the situation? Both Republicans and Democrats in Congress are very rich. Okay? In other words, there's something that attracts money by being in there. And so the exact same argument that you just gave about the individual you said and his impact upon J.D. Vance, I could say the exact same argument against the Biden administration. So what really then comes out, or where you end up yourself, is saying, okay, so how, when they produce their laws or they produce their what they're trying to get across, how much of it is aligned with Scripture and how much of it is not aligned with Scripture? That's where you have to come at. So when we go back to the Democrats of slavery, that does not line up with Scripture. That was against humanity. That's why Thomas Jefferson, George Washington voiced against it. That's why in 1864, when the Republican Party came into being, it was against what they felt was a abomination to mankind, okay, which eventually, with the Civil War, would eliminate it with Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. Then as we go through time, each generation, each person that's in leadership has to be evaluated on what they're actually producing. Now, to go with your argument, I think instead of saying J.D. Vance, it raises the question of what do you do in the situation with immigration and deportations? I think that's where you would have an argument Okay, I'm not saying I would agree with that, but I think that is the central issue of our time. I don't think it's racial inequality now.
Now, let me point out something. The story today is that they are rich, they are billionaires, and therefore they're bad. Which is totally untrue.
Who are we speaking of?
The Democrats right now, and possibly many people have been given the picture that Elon Musk is bad because he's rich.
Who is? Oh, Elon Musk.
Elon Musk.
Yeah.
The Brits say Elon
Yeah.
Musk is bad because he's a billionaire. The billionaires are bad because they're billionaires.
I agree with you.
But that's not true.
Right, I agree with you.
Because they were by God anointed to create products
Amen.
that many use, otherwise still been kept.
Amen.
You see what I'm saying? So,
Yes.
So now the Democrats and other people have taken that around and say Elon Musk is wealthy because of the state, and he wants to, he wants to
Yes.
get